I enjoy reading this article, Awakening is Not Yet Transformation, as it poignantly points out certain common myths on the spiritual path. What propels you to write this article?
Well, I've seen a lot of information on the internet about awakening, and I feel that a lot of that information is either misleading or incomplete or confusing. And also, people have a tendency to confuse awakening and what would be a more durable or lasting transformation. For example, you have some kind of awakening and you're in a high state or what feels like a high state for a few days or a few weeks or maybe a few minutes. While you're in that state, it feels like you had some great realization. But then after some time passes, the feeling fades. Even though the memory might still be there, it doesn't have the same kind of vibrancy and the same kind of feeling as when it originally happened. So I think a lot of people are confused by this and they're not sure what to think, whether they should think, "Oh, I lost the realization," or maybe the opposite. They think, "Oh, I had the realization, therefore it must be permanent," and it didn't go away. They act as if the realization is still active. And in their minds, they feel, "I'm realized," but in their lives, it actually doesn't play out that way. It really is something that's faded somewhat, and they've reverted back to however they were before the realization. So I think it's helpful to have a framework from which you can understand and put a put a frame on how these things actually work.
So, can you talk about why awakening alone is not enough and it's pitfall? Can you explain further?
Sure. The way the way things work is that there's a human being. It's a human being is not a thing. It's we're not a You're not a person like the way you think that you're a person. What you are is more like a system. Okay, a system and a set of relationships and a, a process. Okay, I mean, I know that sounds a little bit scientific, but if you, without taking away the human dimension, if you think of it more like this is a system and there's something happening here, then systems have a way of uh, always returning to some stable state. Okay. So that stable state in mathematics, that's called an attractor. And attractor meaning it attracts the the system toward that particular type of state. So for example, you have an identity, right? You have a name, you have a history, you have a story about your life, you have a job, you have lots of people in your life who have memories about you, and it all has a certain kind of consistency to it. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's like a human life, right? That's the way it should be. So, given all that, that's the system, right? And that's the attractor basin that your life will return to. But if you want to have a real transformation and you want to be different in some way, then you have to actually build a new attractor basin somewhere else. Okay, you don't have to change your name or your job. You can keep all of that, but and your friends may not relate to you as different at all, but something about your own relationship with your own story about yourself and your story about reality and your story of your identity, that all needs to get rewired. And just having a single awakening, it can start you on the path in the right direction, and it's a good step, but it's not the whole thing. So what'll happen is, it's like, so if you think of an attractor like a valley, and then there's a mountain, and then there's like another valley over here where maybe a different attractor is. Having an awakening is like taking a few steps up the mountain, right? But if you stop, you're gonna, if you take the easy path, right, you'll just go back down the mountain to where you started. Whereas what you really need to do is climb the whole mountain and then go down to the other side, and then you'll be in a different place. But that climbing, that's the spiritual cultivation. That's the real practice. That's where the real difficulty in having a truly durable transformation comes about. So an awakening, the way I'm using the word awakening, so awakening is usually it's like a sudden change in perception, or a sudden shift in how your system is perceiving the world and relating to the world, and how you feel, and maybe how you're operating. Let me give you an example. So a lot of people, sometimes they try psychedelic medicines of different kinds, right? LSD or ayahuasca, these kinds of things. Often what happens in that kind of experience, especially the very first time, is you come to a realization that the reality that you thought you were perceiving is not what you thought it was. It's something else. You may not fully understand it, but you definitely understand that it's not what you originally thought. So what happens is that has the effect of destabilizing your current attractor. So it might cause a little bit of chaos in your life, or it might cause you to shift and change. And in some cases, if you take it further, it can cause a more durable or permanent type of change. But just that experience alone, usually it's not enough.
In the section of retreat container, you wrote, the aim is not to turn daily life into a retreat. That would be fantasy. The aim is to learn from the retreat without mistaking the container for the transformation. So in these words, you point out the value of retreat, yet paradoxically, you also explain why its effects may not last as long as people expect or hope. Can you elaborate further on this?
Yes. When I talk about retreat, I'm talking about that kind of long, formal retreat. Something like Buddhist Vipassana retreat, or maybe Zen Sesshin. I think that's what they call it, Sesshin. Where you might go for, if you're an average person, you might go for 10 days or 2 weeks or something like that. If you're more serious, you might go for quite a bit longer. Like, people go for 3 months, or they go for a year. In rare cases, people might even go for several years. But the point is that when you do that kind of formal retreat practice, your environment is very controlled, right? Your daily routine is very set, and you have particular periods of meditation. It's quiet. The food is appropriate to creating the kinds of results that you want to get on a retreat. And you also have teachers present who you can go and ask questions at just the right times. And so it's kind of an ideal setting for creating an awakening of some sort. Okay, so it's much more common for people to have awakenings on that kind of retreat than it is in their ordinary daily life. But like many awakenings, very often when you leave the retreat, so when I'm referring to the container, it's really the environment of the retreat. So when you leave that setting and go back to your job and your family and everything else, your tendency is to slide back into the old attractor basin and away from whatever the state of the system was when you were in the retreat. So it can be frustrating if you don't relate to it in an effective way, where you feel, oh, the experience faded, I really wish I could have it back. I need to either immediately go to another retreat, or I need to try to recreate the retreat container at my home, or I need to go live in a cave or something like this, right? Or go live in an ashram for a while or something like this, right? And those kinds of things, for some people, that's an appropriate thing to do, but it's really not for everyone. For most people, it's not realistic to spend their entire life in a retreat, because let's say you have children, you need to raise your children, you have other responsibilities that you don't necessarily want to give up. And, perhaps you're married or you have a partner. All of these kinds of things, it's not necessarily so easy to just throw all that away and go live in a cave or go live in an ashram. And even if you do, let's say you do join a convent or an ashram or a monastic order, well, you have to ask yourself the question, is that how you want to live the rest of your life? Maybe you want to go there for 5 years, but usually those kinds of settings, they ask you to commit to something quite a bit more. Not always, but sometimes. So what do you want out of your life, right? Do you want to live for the rest of your life in an ashram and live that life? It's a good question. I think if people fantasize about going to live in a cave, I think sometimes they don't think about, well, if that's the rest of your life or a very big portion of your life, is it an appropriate trade-off? Because if you go there even for 5 years and you come back, you still might slide back to the original being, or at least slide back somewhat. Maybe not all the way back, but it's very difficult it's really difficult to near impossible to reproduce whatever the retreat environment is in your own home. You can make your home more suitable for meditation and more suitable for transformation, but it's not the same thing, and it never will be.
I think one common myth is that people tend to think if I can live in that kind of container, it will make my practice more effectively or reach certain desired spiritual state more rapidly.
Well, you could get to the awakening more rapidly, but there's more to a transformation, a durable transformation, than just an awakening. For example, all of your emotional attachments and things like this. In fact, in some cases, it's more difficult in a retreat environment to really do the work to transform those things than it might be at home, because if you're by yourself all the time and you don't have lots of human contact and lots of human relationships, you won't get pushed to refine your emotions in the same way. If you have a spouse, you're definitely going to get pushed to refine your emotions. So it's just each setting has its own ways that it can help you and push you. And it might be appropriate to be in a retreat setting for an extended period of time if you're looking to achieve a particular kind of transformation. But then once you have that, you may find, oh, now I need to work on my relationships, or now I need to work on my anger issues, or now I need to work on my physical body, or something like this, right? There's lots of different things that can contribute to the transformation. It's multidimensional and multi-domain.
So awakening indeed is a very complex project. In your article, especially in the section when awakening becomes another identity, you wrote, the old attractor does not always return in its previous form. Sometimes it recruits the awakening itself. Energetic sensitivity can be real. Non-attachment can be real. Spacious awareness, Kundalini movement, devotional calling, and non-dual recognition may all name serious dimensions of practice. The danger is not that such language is always false. The danger is subtler. The old pattern may learn to hide inside language that originally pointed beyond it. I feel these words sharply illuminate the traps and illusions that can arise on the spiritual path.
I think most people, if they've been around long enough, they've run into at least one person in their lives who had some sort of awakening and then became very inflated. Like the ego movement around that person took on the identity of the awakening itself. And then the person just became very pompous, or maybe less sensitive or more detached, but in a way that felt
Inauthentic?
Inauthentic, yes. Less human, but maybe trying to put themselves on some sort of pedestal. And it's challenging, right? Because let's say you have a genuine awakening. Let's say the kind of awakening you have is one where you've transcended the usual notions of identity. So you look into the mirror and you see something, but you don't say, oh, that's me. You just, the thought, that's me, just doesn't arise. Okay. Now, everybody does experience life like that, at least for part of their lives, but they just don't notice. Because what you notice is, oh, at some point, the idea, this is me, returns and takes over, at least for some period of time. So, but what can happen is you can come to the point where that notion, this is me, just doesn't ever arise. Okay. Now that might last for a few days or a few years or some period of time, and you may have come to the point where it's just never coming back. But regardless, you have to adjust to that. And it might turn out to be the case that in your adjustment to that, you might become something, you might become somebody who's less compassionate or less loving or more pompous or very detached from life or depressed. There's lots of things that can happen. I'm not suggesting that bad things will necessarily happen. In some cases, all that happens is all really great stuff too. But just because you've had that shift, whether it's durable or temporary, it doesn't mean that you've had necessarily all the other shifts that would suggest that you're really living in a very different domain, like a domain that's completely transformed. There's many ways in which you can transform. In fact, I would suggest, I can't say for sure, but my experience suggests to me that this is something that goes on forever. There's no end to transformations that can occur. So you might move to a different attractor, but that doesn't mean you can't move further to another one. You can move part way and then slide back, or you can move all the way to a new state, but that state may not be that far from where you started, and there's further to go. And if you look, you can certainly see what's out in front of you. Even if you don't know what it is, you can certainly see areas in your life where you could improve. In the end, what I think one should ask oneself, what is it that I want to do with my life? Right? What's this life about? How do I want to live this life? And one should endeavor to move towards states which would allow you to fulfill whatever those visions are. But if your only vision is, oh, I want to become enlightened, then I would suggest it's pretty empty, actually. Because, all right, so now you're enlightened, what are you going to do with your life? And I'm not suggesting people shouldn't spend time working on their enlightenment. That's a great thing to spend some time on. But even if you achieve that, there are still other things in life as well. Infinitely many possibilities.
Well, that involves, what's the definition of enlightenment, right? And I think a lot of times people may think, oh, I want to, well, at least from Buddhism perspective, to be free from the wheel of samsara.
Free from suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's one way you could define it.
Or free from reincarnation, from the pain, from the suffering. Like
I think
you can be free from all that.
Yeah, I think it's it's easier to verify whether or not you're free from suffering than it is to verify whether you're free from reincarnation. Right? For most people, at least. Maybe there are people who can verify both. I don't know, but I don't know anybody who's certain and can prove it to others that they're free from reincarnation. But free from suffering, okay, that's also hard to prove to others, but I think it's not that difficult to determine if somebody has suffering going on or not. You can test them. And certainly in your own experience, if you're suffering or not, you'll have a pretty good idea if you're honest with yourself, at least. I don't personally, so that's, maybe you could say that's one of the Buddhist definitions of enlightenment. I don't have any definition of enlightenment because I feel it's one of these words that's overused, and it's used in so many different ways. Nobody really knows what it means. So when I talk about these things, I would talk about awakening and a transformation. Awakening would be like perceiving beyond your current attractor basin, and transformation would be moving to a new attractor basin where your life as a system forms around a different set of experiences. So there might be less suffering in that other basin, in that other attractor, than there was in this one. And if so, great. It might not be completely free from suffering, but maybe less so, ideally. And maybe it has some other, better properties than wherever you started. But from my perspective, I think you can only ever just move from one to another. It's not like there's some final one that, or if there is some final one, you would no longer be a being at all. You'd just be absorbed into the Tao, or something like the way they say, right? So if you really want to escape from reincarnation, maybe you get absorbed back into into God consciousness and just dissolve in that, and then there's nothing left. Okay, that's one possible way to go. But I don't know, like, I don't think it's necessarily something that one ought to strive for, me personally.
So in the section, awakening becomes another identity, I particularly resonate with this section. I'm going to quote one paragraph here. You wrote, "A genuine opening can become the raw material for a new identity structure. The person who once organized around insecurity may now organize around being awakened. The person who once sought approval through competence may seek it through spiritual depth. The person who once avoided pain through distraction may avoid it through transcendence. The spiritual surface has changed, but the deeper attractor may not have." So I feel I almost compelled to highlight every paragraph in this section. It points out how cunningly the ego can hide itself along the spiritual path. It
Yes.
just resonates
Well,
with what you just said.
this is an example where if you have some genuine shift in your perception, which a lot of people are having these days, right? And so I think these awakenings are mostly genuine. So I don't want to dismiss them or say that they're not important. They are. But there are other dimensions of transformation, and if you really want to be free of suffering, for example, it's not enough to just see that I'm not a person the way I thought I was before. There's not a me inside here anywhere. The me is a story, right? It's a story that got made up, and it's expressed in various ways. So even if that story dissolves, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not going to be suffering, because suffering may be linked to emotional problems, emotional attachments, or other patterns that exist at other levels of the system. Okay. So to really move to a completely different system and the way the system's acting into a new attractor, it may take more than just a perceptual shift. If I go to an ayahuasca ceremony, certainly I'm gonna have a shift in consciousness, right? But did I really heal myself? Was I really healed? I might have felt healed for the time I was in the ceremony, but a few days later, a week later, something like that, in most cases, you won't feel completely healed. You might feel a little bit better, and that's good if you do, right? And certain aspects of your life may improve, but it's pretty unlikely that your entire life is going to shift into nothing but bliss. It's just not realistic. The danger is you're just going to take those things that didn't really change, and you're going to try to hide them, because there's a certain, almost like a shame associated with, well, I had an awakening, but didn't handle everything. And so if I want to really prove that I'm awakened, I gotta cover that up. And that's just, it's dishonest. It's less important that it's dishonest with other people. It's being dishonest with yourself. And it's better to just be free and open about that and say, well, I shouldn't even expect all of that to get handled. It's just not the way things work. That's why I wanted to write this essay and do this video, because I feel there's too much expectation that people have that I'm going to have the final awakening and all my problems are going to suddenly disappear. I can tell you for certain that that is not a place where you actually want to be. It's a fantasy. Because, in essence, you would become a spiritual couch potato if that happened.
What does that mean?
So actually, even the Buddhists, I think, have some, they have some teachings about this, right? They say that if a being goes to certain heavens, you will stay in the heavens for some period, maybe a long period of time if your karma is really great. Okay, so you did a bunch of work on yourself, you became this great being, you went to the heavens, and you just hung out. It was so pleasant and so great and so final.
Oh, I see.
You just don't do anything. You're like a spiritual couch potato in heaven, okay? And then eventually your good karma runs out and you fall back down to the human realm or some lower realm than whatever heaven you were in. That's one of the stories, right? And so I'm not going to validate or verify that story, but the principle is true, right? If you really did achieve some final state and you just became a spiritual couch potato and did nothing, then you will fall back to a lower state attractor. That's what will happen. just like if let's say you worked out a lot, you went to the gym, every day for 5 years, you worked out, you lifted weights, you did everything, you're in great shape, you're a world-class athlete, and then you're like, okay, you won the Olympic gold medal, I don't know, you achieved some high state, and then you just stopped. Are you going to stay there? No, you're going to start to decay. That's the way things work. So if you want to continue to maintain, there's no permanence, right? Everything's impermanent. So if you want to maintain, what you really need to do is keep working out. And that applies spiritually as well. So there's no final state. You always, you'll get there, and if you don't keep working out, you're going to slide back. That's just the way things work. Okay. The Buddhists talk about impermanence, right? That's one of the three characteristics in Buddhism. So nothing's permanent, including whatever awakening state you came to. It's not a permanent state. It's a dynamical system. It may be a very stable attractor, which stays that way for a very long time, maybe the rest of your life. And maybe, who knows, maybe several lifetimes afterwards, I don't know. But the point is that these things are systems that are in constant flux and change. And if something looks permanent, it just means it's a very stable attractor. It's not an actual permanent state. There's no such thing. So there's no permanent enlightenment. Other than, whatever's behind all this may be the only thing that's permanent, though. It's not even a thing, right? It's whatever it is.
So are you saying that
But in terms of form, living in the world, there's no such thing as permanent.
So even you have reached the state of samadhi, you cannot stay in that state forever?
There's no permanence to whatever the state is. Even those states themselves there's some fluctuations. And generally speaking, you can go into one of those states. You can even stay in that state for the rest of your life. That's possible. A lifetime is not a permanent thing, right? It ends at some point. So I'm not saying you can't reach a state and maintain that state for the rest of your life. It's possible. But even that's not permanent, right? You're going to die, you're going to move on, whatever happens after that, whether you move on to other realms or who knows. But the point is, none of this is permanent. I think we have this kind of fantasy thinking of enlightenment as some sort of permanent state of bliss. There is no permanent state of bliss. Whatever's behind reality has a certain kind of eternal nature to it. But that doesn't even exist in time, so you can't say it's permanent. Permanent suggests that time is involved. So if you're thinking in terms of time, that doesn't even apply. You could say it's eternal in the sense that it's timeless.
I think you were trying to make spiritual practices more real and less mystical when you indicated that serious traditions are safeguards against the old self, using spiritual material to become harder to detect. So what's going to happen when we don't have this foundations or safeguard.
Let me say a little bit more about what I meant by that. I think the most important thing is when you start to get to higher and higher states, it becomes more and more important to maintain a certain humility and to recognize that there's always more. And one can also slide back. No matter how far you've gotten, you can always slide back. It's just like, I think the metaphor of an athlete is a really good one, because you can see professional athletes after they age, they start to atrophy and they become less capable as athletes than they once were. So now I'm not suggesting that awakening and transformation work the same way exactly as athletics does, but what I'm saying is it suggests the possibility that it's something that you actually need to maintain. You can't just become a spiritual couch potato, like I said. So it's important to maintain a certain kind of humility, a certain kind of discipline, and not get too inflated. Especially some of these experiences, awakening experiences, the further you go and so forth, some of these experiences can be quite remarkable. And just mind-blowing. The point here is that it's helpful to have teachers and guides who can keep you working, keep you disciplined, not let you stray off in the wrong direction, and not to get too caught up in the glory of a particular awakening, because the feeling of the big change of the awakening, actually, that typically doesn't last. Even if the awakening if the transformation becomes durable, the big explosion, whatever it was that you experienced at that time, which might have been amazing, that part of it fades, no matter what. Like, the first time you experience some huge bliss, if you're able to come back to that same bliss, you won't even be as excited about it the second or third time. It's like anything else. But it's sort of like maybe the first time you met your lover or something like that, you might have been super excited and be like, oh, this is so great, and you're in this honeymoon phase for some period of time, but then things kind of settle down. And some people think that settling down is boring, and then they go seeking another great big high. But that's actually a mistake, because it's a failure to recognize that, a stable marriage, for example, might be a really great thing. Might even be much better than the original excitement that one felt when it was very new. So spiritual cultivation is like this as well, right? You want to get to a state where you're in a stable marriage. You're in a stable marriage with God, right? You're not you're not permanently in a state of the initial excitement of finding the new lover. Now, there is something about, you can get to a state where there's quite a steady feeling of this is really unfolding in a very powerful and exciting way. but it won't feel like you won't feel the same contrast with the past, because if it's ongoing all the time, it's just going to be the way you are. You're just going to be always in that kind of state of heightened creativity and heightened awareness and heightened like bliss, but it's not going to be exciting in the same way that is like if you're in a much lower state and then suddenly you jump up to this state. You notice a huge contrast, right? If you then stay in that state for a long time, the contrast goes away. It's like, okay, here's another example. Let's say, I'll use it with a good smell, okay? Let's say you walk into somebody's house and they have some very fragrant wood in their house. It's made of cedar or something like this. When you first walk in, you're like, oh, wow, that smells so fresh. I can smell the wood, all this. But if you actually live in that house, you won't smell that smell at all, even though it's still there. So it's kind of similar, right?
So that's why you mentioned about practice gives awakening somewhere to live. Would you like to elaborate on why multi-domain practice matters, especially from the perspective of environmental design?
Well, I think we talked about a lot of this already, but in essence, you have, so there are many dimensions of being, right? There's many dimensions to the system. There's the mental dimension, the physical dimension, the emotional dimension, the volitional and just more subtle dimensions of consciousness and so forth. All of these dimensions ultimately need to be attended to, because if you neglect any one of them, it will basically, it's like the chain is only as strong as its weakest link, right? So if you have some weak links in your chain, maybe your perception and your mental formations are very very advanced. So you came into an awareness of what reality is, and you have that at a very deep level. But if you're not emotionally refined, maybe you're just having emotional outbursts all the time, or you have difficulties with your relationships or something. Or, there are other people who are like, maybe they're emotionally quite mature and they have very open heart and they're very compassionate and loving, and it's amazing to be around these kinds of people. But then in their mind, they can't tell heads from tails. They're just confused all the time, or they're just making up nonsense that doesn't make any sense, and they don't really perceive things clearly. So those kind of people, eventually, those shortcomings will also create hindrances in their lives. So we all have different, levels of competence in different areas of our lives, and that's normal. But the point is to endeavor to develop all of them, not just one. If you focus only on one, you'll become very imbalanced.
So during practice, people oftentimes might experience self-doubt, wondering, is my practice actually working? Or is anything really being transformed? What advice you will offer in response to this?
Well, I find it's sometimes helpful to look back. You think, where was I 1 year ago? When it comes to this kind of thing, actually, certain practices can be really helpful. So, for example, if you keep a journal, you could go look at your journal entries from 1 year ago, or 2 years ago, or 10 years ago, and you can actually see your progress. I think also it's just in part it's just a matter of faith, right? If you put in the effort and you're sincere, it's pretty much guaranteed that you'll make some progress. It may not be along the dimension you were hoping, but you will make progress at least along one of these dimensions. And I think, or one or more. And I think also that's why it's important to be aware of sort of the multi-domain nature of the system, because if you recognize that it's a system with many domains, many dimensions, then you won't feel like, you may recognize, oh, even though I didn't make progress along this one direction as much as I would have liked, I really did make progress along some other directions. And that was really actually very helpful. So I think it's just, I feel there's a kind of flattening that occurs, especially if you look on YouTube or something where people talk about different dimensions of awakening, and they talk about them as if that's like the only dimension there is. And it's just not the case. I mean, not everybody has the same experience of Kundalini or something like this, right? Some people have a big explosion. Some people have all sorts of problems. Some people have more minor. Some people have more subtle. There's all different ways it can play out. But it's very easy to go watch somebody's video and they had some huge explosion and you think, oh, something is wrong with me if I didn't have that huge explosion of bliss. But it's just not the way things work. It's like, just because I'm not in the NBA doesn't mean I can't enjoy basketball. And I might be much better at mathematics than somebody who plays in the NBA. Right? There's many dimensions of life, and the same is true in spiritual cultivation, right? It's not a single dimension.
So speaking of the trials that come after awakening, you mentioned the importance of daily practice in order to create an environmental field, as well as the challenges one may encounter within it. So regarding these trials, why do you emphasize coherence? What do you mean by that?
If you want to give some definition to enlightenment, what I would say is it's a movement in the direction of greater coherence. And by coherence, I mean you can integrate all of what's included in the universe. Like, you can take in more of it, and you can make sense of the whole in a way that's more inclusive, right? So it's like you have a deeper awareness and a deeper understanding and a deeper feeling about everything that is. And you can gather it all into your experience, and you can see the unity in it, and you can put it together in very complex and deep ways, right? And you can experience the richness of it in a way that all fits together nicely. Although, it might feel messy, but the point is that even if it's messy, you can include all of it. And so all of the differences that arise from like distinction in relationship, all of those differences can be integrated into the whole of what you are. So that's what I mean by coherence. And the greatest coherence, I would say, is love, right? Now, love, not love in the most sort of sentimental and Hollywood kind of picture of love, but I mean love in a very deep spiritual sense. Okay. So ultimately, everything eventually moves in that direction, toward that kind of coherence.
I think the discussion clears up many misconceptions about spiritual practice and provides a very clear explanation for the frustration people might feel when life returns to normal after a retreat. Before we end, do you have anything else you want to say?
I would just say, keep going, keep practicing. It's a long road. Transformation is the long road. Awakenings are the sudden realizations on the road, but a truly valuable transformation is achieved through sustained, long, and disciplined effort and focused attention. So I would just encourage people, don't give up. Don't take on a feeling of shame just because your awakening faded. That's normal. In almost all cases, that's what happens to it. The important thing is what you do after it fades. If you keep going, keep practicing, keep making the effort, maintain your discipline, keep working out, right? Then you will continue to have new openings and new awakenings. It's inevitable. And eventually, the transformations will become more and more durable.